Nice and online. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's installation of the weekly lecture series of the Center for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. My name is Ted Gerber, and I'm the faculty director of CREECA. And as I noted, this is a weekly lecture series. So before we move to today's programming, let me tell you that next week, at the same time, same place on Zoom, as March 4th at 4 p.m. Central Time, we'll have a three-person presentation. The three colleagues will be presenting together. Their lecture is entitled The Gendered Ambiguity of the Post-Communist Transitions, and that's going to be presented by Professors Janet Elise Johnson, Cataline Fabian, and Maria Lazda. And you can see our entire schedule on the CREECA website, which is creeca.wisc.edu. So a few logistical things as well. We ask you to please mute your mics and your video during the lecture and hold your questions until the end. And once we finish with today's presentation, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. And so for that purpose, please use the raise hand function, which you can see under the participants key if you have a question. Also, today's presentation will be recorded. So I have one other note, and that is in case, we don't usually get journalists or anything in our lecture series, but just in case there are any journalists in the audience, today's presentation is officially off the record. So we're very delighted today to welcome back to CREECA Carolyn Savage, who is one of our, probably, if not one of our most distinguished alumni. She received a master's degree in Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies and also political science from UW-Madison. She's also a native of Wisconsin, so it's very great to have her here. She's a career foreign service officer. She served most recently as director of the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Press Center. And as a non-resident fellow currently at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, her focus is on diverse diplomacy, leadership, and foreign affairs. She served in other capacities in U.S. embassies in Azerbaijan and Mozambique, and she will talk more about that. She's also was also director for Russia and Central Asia on the National Security Council and a political military officer in the U.S. Department of State's Office of Russian Affairs. So today we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to take a somewhat informal approach rather than ask Carolyn to prepare some formal, official sounding lecture. This is going to take the form of a conversation. So I'll be asking Carolyn some questions, and it'll be great to hear from her. I know that many in the audience are students who perhaps are interested in the career path or a career path similar to Carolyn's. And so I want to start out by trying to get a sense of the various positions that one can hold, and that, you know, how one moves from one position to another within the Foreign Service. And because Carolyn has now been at it for quite some time, perhaps you could start, please, by giving us an overview of your career, starting with your first posting.
Sure, absolutely. But hey, I just first of all start and say thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you and to speak with your students today. I only wish that we were in Madison. I saw a great photo of Lake Mendota and the campus, and just remember fondly the last time that I was invited to meet with some of your graduate students there. And I recall the time very fondly, and hope we'll have sort of as active and sort of engaged of a conversation both ways today. Really enjoyed sort of even along the sidelines and after the sort of official talk, having the chance to talk with your students. So I hope we'll have those opportunities as well. But yeah, it's great. It's great to see you, especially in this COVID era. It's great that we're able to do this, and I thank you and applaud the efforts. I know technical and logistical efforts to do this sort of thing are sort of, not exactly new challenges nearly a year in, but still are formidable obstacles to that human connection. That I hope, we're able to sort of circumnavigate today. But I guess to answer your first question, trying to get a grasp on how the Foreign Service career works. Really, it's quite a straightforward sounding process. You just take the exam, and it's offered 3 or 4 times a year. And you take the written exam, and then wait a while longer and then take the oral exam. And the key big hurdle for me personally, it might be a hurdle for students or potential future applicants, is always the security clearance as much as the health clearance. But the security clearance for folks who spend a lot of time in the foreign service, for me, took 3 years.
Wow, 3 years.
They say that they want to recruit people who have language and overseas experiences, but then that ends up being sort of an obstacle to efficient entry into the service. But it still managed, to join eventually. And I was thrilled and all the more prepared, I think, to do so because of the extra time to sort of work and study and do some other sort of deep diving into the areas that I was most interested in. But I came in because I spoke French from undergraduate and from like high school, middle school studies, and then I studied Russian. Starting with a State Department sponsored exchange program in high school. And then I continued studying Russian through college and studied abroad in college, and then continued studies in my graduate years. I came in with French and Russian, and the State Department knew it. So that really did shape the 2 first assignments that I was given. And the first 2 assignments that we get in the Foreign Service are directed assignments. They give you a very long list of 90 or 100 places that you could go. You rank order them, and then it's really just the luck of the draw in terms of what you end up with. Except for people who tested in language, it's really not the whole world that's open. They really did pick me for Luxembourg, my first post, because I spoke French, and they needed someone to go with 3 French, like professional level French, immediately to help out during the European Union presidency. It's a great disappointment to me to be assigned to Luxembourg. I was hoping to get to Central Asia or do something a little more adventurous right out of the gate at 25 years old. But they sent me to Luxembourg, and it ended up being a great first experience because it's this tiny little embassy and like a laboratory of all things diplomatic that happen are done by a very small number of people. So I learned a lot during that tour and ended up wearing basically every hat throughout the embassy. And then, I was again disappointed, frustrated when I was assigned to Belarus for my second assignment because I had been offered to be the public affairs officer in Turkmenistan or do consular work in St. Petersburg. And I am public diplomacy coned, which meant that I checked a box saying that I want to do public diplomacy when I took the exam. And I thought, I would love to do public diplomacy in Turkmenistan, but I'd really like to go back to St. Petersburg. So I said, I'll go to St. Petersburg. They sent me to Minsk, and I was like, I'm not sure if I'm going to do consular work in Minsk. It's going to be pretty boring. Well, it wasn't boring at all. About 5 months into my tour, they kicked everyone out of the country except for me and 3 of my colleagues. And it ended up being, I think, incredibly well prepared from my Luxembourg experience to help basically run everything that 35 Americans used to do with 4 people, 4 diplomats. There was still about 120 local staff. So that was a great experience. Both of them. I was disappointed to get the assignment, thrilled in the end that I was there to do the work. And both of those were 2-year assignments, as those were sort of directed assignments. They're pretty standardized at 2 years. And after that, I had been given the advice that you should come back to Washington to learn how the Washington policy making process works. Whereas we sort of implement the policies at posts, you really do participate in the policy making process, even in a very junior position as I was in at the Russia desk, in very significant ways. So I went back to the Russia desk, as I think you mentioned in your introduction. I did the Paul Mill and foreign policy job for Russia at the time that we were just starting the reset with Russia. If anybody remembers that still. in 2009. Yeah, it seems like the distant memory compared to the last few years. But it was an interesting time to be doing a lot of work, sort of building up the cooperative elements of the relationship. and working on a lot of the sort of big pieces of that, between Iran cooperation and Middle East peace. Worked a lot on Afghanistan and Afghan transit because we were really building up our force presence in Afghanistan. At that time, we needed Russia and Central Asia to a great extent to cooperate with us on sort of legal grounds, but then military transit through their countries. So it was on the grounds of that work that I was recruited, as you mentioned, to go to the National Security Council, where they let me work on Russia and Central Asia policy, which was a great opportunity. And I think just, it was at the right place at the right time. It turned out to be a very formative and very exciting time for my career. At the same time, then I was getting married to a man who was an Africanist by vocation, and he left the Marine Corps to join the State Department. And we agreed that for our first assignment, we would go to Mozambique, and we put all of our eggs in the basket of lobbying the world to give both of our careers a chance in Mozambique. So I left the National Security Council and moved to be a public affairs officer in Mozambique. I was in charge of about an 18-person team running all sort of media, cultural affairs, educational programming, civil society support for our 800-person mission in Mozambique. It was great, and it was a total change of pace and way outside of my sort of academic and professional experience that thus far, but a really great learning experience as well. I admit, after 3 years away, I was starting to get a real hankering to come back to the region, and we bid then on Azerbaijan. So we got joint assignments in Azerbaijan, where we served from 2016 to 18. And then so it was 3 years in Mozambique, 2 years in Azerbaijan, because they didn't let my husband extend, so we weren't able to stay 3 years. And then we came back to Washington again. Mainly just to get our feet back on American soil, and then get ready to go back out again. So we're going to Kazakhstan in August.
Oh, exciting!
Pandemic, but it's going to be exciting, and it's going to be a 3-year tour in Almaty. So. Wow.
Okay. Well, that's great. You probably know that we have a tight connection between UW and Nazarbayev University, which is
yes,
Sultan. But if you ever make it over to Nur Sultan, it'd be great if you checked in with some of our colleagues who are over there.
Oh, absolutely. I think I'll be there about once a month. So.
Yeah. So then, before I ask the next question, just a few quick follow-ups. So it sounds like you're in terms of like where you go for each posting. Your typical postings last for 3 years, it sounds like, and then you have a little bit of say, but not total freedom in terms of where you go next. And is that fairly typical of foreign service officer careers? That you get some discretion, but not free will, so to speak?
Yeah, the first 2 assignments are very much directed. Only really people who came in with language had a sense of where they might end up for those 2 tours. Everybody else, it was really like a grab bag of countries, and it's a really interesting experience trying to weigh Indonesia versus Sudan. Discuss, you just have to figure it out. But after those first tours, I've come out of all the bid cycles feeling as though my choices and my research and my drive to go to the places has very much shaped where I've ended up. I've gotten my first or second choice, I think, every time I've bid. So it hasn't been,
Oh, that's great. That's encouraging to know.
Yeah, as the first 2 tours.
So you also mentioned that people with language skills, language training, it takes longer for them to get a security clearance. So I want to ask you about that. Is that what is the reason for that? And is it does the government trust people who speak foreign languages less than people who only speak English?
I don't know if I would go that far. Now,
I'm exaggerating.
To be clear, this happened long ago, and I've been in 17 years now, so hopefully things have sped up by now. But I would say that every place that you've lived requires an extra file, and that requires a different set of people to go and knock on the doors and make the phone calls to all the people that you've known. And if you've been in touch with a lot of foreigners, well, then they're going to call, and dig a little bit deeper. So they kind of make you do an exhaustive list of foreigners that you've lived with and then have been close friends with and had close contact with. So it's a double sword, right? Of course, you want someone who has the ability to connect, and yet, yes, that extra bureaucratic.
These extra vetting, extra background checks and so forth. Right. Okay, well, so you received a master's degree or at the UW or joint master's degree, and I know we have a lot of students who are either currently in master's programs or else undergraduates who are thinking about perhaps undertaking master's level study. So I'm curious how you see your master's training fitting into your career. Did it, was it useful? Was it a waste of time? Was it just kind of a credential? Could you give us some examples of how it may or may not have proven useful to you to do that master's?
So I found it to be wildly useful in many different ways and still continues to be for a lot of different reasons. I mean, not just the language, which seems like the most sort of obvious and sort of almost tangible, demonstration of what a sort of can take away and put to work, but also the sort of disciplined writing process, the reading and then briefing, analyzing in a written form and an oral form is really something, both the written form and the oral form that you have to be really good at. And having had this sort of master's level kind of training that I got at Madison with the CREECA program was undoubtedly very helpful to make clear and persuasive and also sort of fast and regular briefings is just part of the daily, if not hourly, work of the diplomat. And I also would say, I really think the multidisciplinary approach of my CREECA training was very helpful in a lot of ways. I mean, the basis in sort of the broader areas that I studied there, including like literature and history, in addition to and geography, in addition to just politics, which sort of people, when you think of diplomacy, it's mainly political, government related. No, it's really, the basis to connect with people is actually much, much broader than that. And so doing the work on the ground, that has been a benefit. But, also I got to the Russia desk as a very junior officer. I'd been in like 5 years, I think, by the time I was the Paul Mill officer in this big job. And there were about 15 or 16 of us on the desk at that time, of which maybe 2 to 3 of us spoke the language, and maybe one other. She actually had a PhD from Austin and in the field. And she and I were the only 2 out of 15 who had serious academic training in this area. And, I was charged at the time, I sort of volunteered to set up this briefing series where I brought in a bunch of academics and think tankers to brief the desk, because most of the desk, that is the people making the policy on a day-to-day basis, didn't have a background in Russian and Russian studies and Russian areas. Wow. So I know it seems hard to imagine, right?
But it's a little hard to imagine. It's a little scary to think about, actually.
It is. And so, guess who my first briefer was? It was Fiona Hill. She was our first briefer, and I managed to line up all these people to come and tell us, how they saw Russia. And well, it was great, 15 of us around a table trying to learn everything that we learned in a master's program. Probably wasn't as thorough as it could have been, but it was a start. And I was really well poised to be able to help inform the group, I thought.
All right, well, that's good to know then. So for all you MA students out there, it's well worth your time to do lots of writing and learn the language really well and all that stuff. So, for a lot of us, the whole U.S. government policy making and diplomacy processes are somewhat opaque. We hear on the news that the U.S. is doing this or the other, but of course we recognize that the U.S. government is a big, complex animal, and that its various pieces don't always see eye to eye, and there must be, internal debates and conflicts among different agencies. So maybe you could give us some insights into what happens, for somebody in the positions you've held. When there's conflict within the government. You say, just to take an example, like maybe the Defense Department, the Department of State have different policies with respect to a particular issue? What goes on behind the scenes? If you give us, obviously without naming names, I guess, when those kinds of conflicts arise.
I don't know why that example just tickles me completely because, yeah, I mean, there are so many conflicts in the policy making process and the policy implementing process. There's like this, you know, in the sort of inside the beltway sobriquet canon, there's always the where you sit determines where you stand, which is one that everyone knows because it's like your bureaucratic loyalties sort of determine your position. Which seems strange, right? We all think we're sort of sui generis, somehow independent, and we control our own fate. But, you know, in many ways, you know, people line up behind their, especially in these hierarchical organizations. You know, people really do, you know, take the direction of their leadership, and the, you know, DoD versus the State Department is a great example. Certainly from the example that I pointed to that I really spent the most time on at the Russia desk and at the National Security Council, working on transit to Afghanistan through Russia and through Central Asia. I mean, this was at a time when we were relying on Pakistan entirely to get all of our troops and materials to Afghanistan. And you know, all of the people who at the State Department who were working on Afghanistan, including Richard Holbrooke, who was still the special representative at that time, were determined to come up with an alternative route because they saw Pakistan to be not a fully reliable partner. Turns out down the road that was true, and they eventually shut down the transit routes. But by that time, we had undertaken years of diplomatic negotiations to get Central Asian governments, to get Russia to agree to lethal transit of materials through planes flying over, through trains coming through, in support of Afghanistan stabilization. And it was a very difficult diplomatic dance to get the Defense Department not just to come along begrudgingly, but then to even activate those routes and start using them. I remember personally having to, you know, do my best to persuade the people who were doing the bureaucratic slow roll. We know it's okay. Yes, we say it's fine, but then we don't do anything. We had to
passive aggressive kind of resistance to.
Oh yeah. And so I remember one meeting that we made happen where Richard Holbrooke talked to a whole slew of generals and basically was booming at the top of his voice saying, you know, anyone in this room who thinks that we're better off relying on Pakistan than Russia can get up and leave right now. It was his way of saying, like, we're going to get this done. And, you know, we did within weeks sort of start the planes flying and the trains rolling. But it really took sort of bureaucratic maneuvering to figure out, like, who's actually the holdup, and then how to bring them along at the end of the day to get that to work. And I continued, you know, throughout my time at the National Security Council to really have to work on DoD because they were not fans of any kind of military cooperation with Russia as an organization. And you know, we can understand why, and yet in certain circumstances, it was very beneficial for the U.S. interest to actually do that, what we could in that sphere. I would say
that's very. Sure, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to mention. I think that in all the embassies overseas that I've ever worked at that have a large interagency, there's always these sorts of dilemmas. And you know, we had sort of a similar issue in Mozambique where we had, you know, over $500 million a year in assistance that we were giving to Mozambique, mainly for health funding, but our incredibly brilliant scientists community and this AID and the CDC offices were not interested in spending time or allocating time or energy or resources to telling the Mozambicans about all the services that we could provide, and helping to persuade them to let go of their sort of stigma attached to HIV and AIDS treatment, that we were giving like $350 million a year to support infrastructure and supplies. But it really took, some of my like best diplomatic work has been the behind the scenes and the finding your allies to make sure that you can, do the thing that makes sense on a strategic level, even when people might prefer to look at their own little piece of the pie and say.
I see. So you have to use your diplomatic skills not only in dealing with foreign entities and governments, but also to work within the U.S. government to accomplish what it is you. Wow, that's a very interesting perspective. So on a similar topic, I'm sure a lot of particularly given where we are right now in terms of the new administration. You served under now. I mean, I don't know exactly, but was this now? It will be your fourth different presidential administration, I think, or at least your third.
W. So
okay, you came in with W, right? So it's the W, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. So what is it like when you have change at the top, and these administrations have varied quite a bit in terms of their foreign policy? How do you deal with that? Especially when new political appointees come in at the top of the State Department or in various capacities. What's it like having to deal with it must be challenging, I would expect, to shift gears.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I guess I'll start by answering that. In the field, it's a little bit different, and by that I mean working in an embassy or consulate overseas. It's quite different than working in DC on many grounds, but it's including dealing with political appointees. I've only worked for 2 political appointee ambassadors, and they were both in Luxembourg on my first tour, where another hat tip to the MA training. My Luxembourg ambassador, she said to me during a country team meeting of senior staff, "What's all this about Russia?" And I was like, how much time do you have? I mean, we ended up scheduling an hour-long meeting and then spending like 4 hours one afternoon trying to explain, Russian history and politics, again, in a nutshell, boiling down sort of all my training and research and knowledge that I had to offer at the time. But I mean, in general, I guess I'd say, yeah, I've spent a lot of the election periods overseas. So I was overseas for the 2008 election of Obama, 2012 election of Obama. I was in 2008, I was in Belarus. 2012, I was in Mozambique. 2016 for Trump's election, I was in Azerbaijan. There's often these perceptions of fear of major change or jubilance over perceived biases for the country that you're in. And in Belarus, folks were concerned that Obama was going to come in and sort of be soft on Russia, and that would negatively influence Belarusian affairs. In 2016 in Azerbaijan, there were people who were jubilant because of Trump had a building with his name on it in Azerbaijan. People's perception was that this meant that he was really interested in cooperation and doing business, and it was going to be great for Azerbaijan. But at the end of the day, most countries that we serve in overseas, our policies don't change that much. In terms of what we do every day. This massive body of work continues with some changes and nuances and tweaks around the edges. But I mean, we still have this, the civil service, this foreign service that is still doing a lot of the sort of cooperation and partnership work, sort of regardless of what's happening in Washington. And, the exceptions would be the massive countries that really are in the headlines, which, usually are countable on 1 or 2 hands. But even in those countries, I'd say there's still a lot of work that diplomats are doing that isn't changed that much. So, it feels slightly more insulated overseas when you have a change of power. In DC, it can be, quite different and quite different feeling, in part because you're part of the policy making apparatus, and sometimes you're a lot closer to the political leadership. So you're watching and involved in decision-making processes, sometimes watching people make bad decisions and wrong decisions. And, I certainly find it to be challenging to watch bad decisions being made. I also find, it's a strange, sort of load to take up, to decide, how much of your own blood, sweat, and tears to throw on the table and throw down and try to make your voice heard and argue for a better position. It can be really sort of heart-wrenching if you don't win those battles, but I do enjoy the opportunity to do so and to hopefully get some victories along at least the sidelines for making better policy and making better decisions. But I do think for all of us, I mean, we have to sort of know our red lines and what isn't going to fly for us and what isn't going to work for us. Because, I think anybody who's been in service for a while has had to uphold policies that we don't believe in, that we don't buy into, that we don't think are great. It can be hard.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It must be very frustrating. But there is, I mean, so you're suggesting that there are some occasions where, you can push back a little bit, or at least you can raise some concerns that you might have without fear of retaliation or fear that it might adversely affect your chance for promotions or things like that. I mean, is that, do foreign service officers, is there some kind of policy to guarantee that you have at least are able to express concerns if you have them? Or
yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to know how far you can go and how to go there appropriately. There are awards that our union give every year at numerous different levels and for different specialties. For dissent, constructive dissent. So, I mean, the challenge, of course, is always that you're always beholden to your boss and your boss's boss. And if your boss or your boss's boss disagree with you or don't have your back, then your annual evaluation can suffer and your promotability can suffer. And then your next job is affected by that. So, you have to figure out, again, sometimes the hardest diplomacy is the internal stuff, how much you can, build your allies in whatever it is the fight that you're about to go into. So like if I was going to bat with the DOD, all my bosses were lined up that's what I was going to do. And I was going to try like hell to get them on board. And if I couldn't, then I would bring in bigger guns. So.
But yeah, so but I mean that's the case in any organization, right? I mean, it's not unique to the U.S. government. You have to get your boss and your immediate boss and then their boss on board. Otherwise, you really risk. So that's. But it's good to know that at least there's not this kind of top down only a flow of directives and so forth. There is some leeway for discussion.
Absolutely. In fact, I was sharing an office at Georgetown 2 years ago with this Army colonel, who was also a fellow there. And, we sort of joked about it, that, the directive, and his sort of joke was that the directive comes from the Army general and everyone says, yes, sir, very good, sir, goes about implementing the directive. Whereas in the State Department, the general gives the directive, the senior level official gives the directive, and everybody commences their debate on whether or not thing. So they're just different cultures entirely, I think, in that is just, again, sobriquet that I think reflects the different cultures.
Yeah, that is very, very interesting. Okay, so another one thing, so far we talked mainly about sort of internal government operations and implementing policy and so forth. But have you had the chance when you've been posted in, embassies or other areas abroad, have you had the chance to work with local populations? I mean, we referred a few times to those, but could you tell us more about that? I know a lot of people who are considering foreign service, they're interested in the diplomacy or the politics of it, but they're also very interested in engaging with the local population. So what opportunities present themselves to do that? in the jobs you have?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's why I wanted to do this job, right? I
Mhm.
loved living abroad. I loved the contact with local populations. I loved living with host families and hanging out with students and teaching them and getting to know them and their different perspectives. So, yeah, that for me too, that was a big concern coming into the Foreign Service, because being a student, you don't have this official American sort of badge or albatross, depending on your perspective around your neck. But I really actually have found myself to be as connected to the local populations as I have the energy and time to give. And I really try intentionally to make it a focus to get out of those embassies and get out into the world. And actually sometimes and I think usually by virtue of my position, at least thus far overseas, I've had entry into so many great opportunities to meet some of the most dynamic and interesting and fabulous people that I could have ever hoped for. Particularly, I've been the public affairs officer in 3 countries now, in Belarus and Azerbaijan and Mozambique. And that's the area of the embassy that's really charged with all outreach beyond the government, including journalists and teachers and students and civil society organizations. So, in the PAO job in Belarus, I was funding almost all the major civil society organizations in the country. I was the only one left, so I was the main decision maker, and I got to know all the heads of organizations. We were funding independent media. I knew guys who were printing their newspapers in their garage, and I was funding them with such happiness in my heart, because I knew their story. I knew, sort of what they were putting into their work. And we had American corners in all of these countries as well, 12 of them in Belarus, that, there were basically librarians who doubled as English club leaders and English conversation club leaders and film club, discussion club coordinators. And, in these corners of Belarus where there's very little going on and there's very little regular American presence, they sort of, I don't want to say they're like extra American ambassadors, but they were people who loved us and loved learning English, teaching English, and talking about the sorts of values that we're trying to promote. So whatever moral support and other support that we could provide for them, I loved doing, and I got to know all, those librarians very well. But I'd say that some of the cultural work that I did in Belarus too was extremely powerful and impactful. To me, in a place where we couldn't do a lot because there wasn't a huge amount of independent media that had wide distribution. We did a ton with documentary filmmakers. We'd bring over filmmakers to run, master classes and then documentary film festivals. And I would use that opportunity to bring together opposition activists and artists and actors. And it was an interesting constellation of like-minded people who wanted interesting kinds of changes for their societies. And then, the educational programs, I really feel in Azerbaijan, as in Belarus and in Mozambique, those English language teachers throughout the country are some of our best allies. And they're trying to teach this language and get their hands on the best kinds of materials, and we can help them do that. Then that's great work. So we helped fund their conferences and their trainings and would go out to visit them and help them however we could. Everywhere I went, I got to know some fabulous English language teachers through that time. In Mozambique, I had this Martin Luther King Institute head who was a professor, and he was teaching debate to high school students. And I said, how about if you do one on American policy in the run up to the elections in 2012? And he did this whole series for a semester that culminated in a sort of headliner event at our election party, where these high school students were debating and taking on sort of the personas of the vice presidential candidates and then the presidential candidates. And then there would be a democratic process at the end where all the people at the election event were voting for their, the top debater. And, it was really a civic discourse training that I thought very powerful.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's quite a wide range of different experiences, but clearly it's been a big part of your job. And I didn't realize that I mean, it makes sense that a place like Azerbaijan, that English teachers would be, a group that, the U.S. Embassy would work with to try to, give them materials and resources. Because I guess you probably are limited in terms of the sort of, pro-democracy types of NGOs and in other contexts the U.S. would.
Yeah, sometimes. Though, we managed to restart our funding support to civil society organizations in Azerbaijan when I was there after they had been closed down by the government for 4 years. We restarted our sort of small grants program, basically for any kind of sort of innovative, democratic organization that, wants to do some kind of democracy building effort. Often getting these organizations from nothing to something with, as little as $25,000, but and made the world of difference. So I really love seed funding for these tiny organizations that would otherwise not exist. Was really
I mean, that's really important. Okay, so what would you say? What has been some of the great? Pick maybe one or two of the most difficult challenges you faced in your job. Then maybe one or two of the most rewarding experiences.
Challenging. When you ask me about challenges, what immediately comes to mind, and rewards, truthfully, is like the people aspect of the equation more than like the high policy, sort of more abstract, but nonetheless very meaningful work that I've done. But I mean, I really think about that the people, as much as the policy, can be really both very challenging and very rewarding. I think we don't often think about like the leadership and management aspects of these sorts of jobs, but I mean, even by the time I went to Belarus, I sort of accidentally became in charge of a very competent, capable group of 18 public affairs members in Mozambique as well. In Mozambique, unfortunately, upon my arrival, I couldn't quite account for what 2 of my staff members were doing, and I uncovered malfeasance. They were selling access to our exchange programs and our educational advising programs. It is, if you want to learn how to study in the United States, you can pay me some money on the side. And, it took me a while to excavate that problem and then to fire them and then rehire other people and train them. That was very challenging because I couldn't talk publicly to the other staff members about what was going on, and I had just arrived. So it made me probably look like a monster for a while until some of the parents started coming forward and saying, I gave them all this money and they promised me an exchange program. And we're like, we don't sell exchange programs.
Goodness.
Yeah, that was really depressing. But fortunately, we turned it around and I think changed the narrative that the United States doesn't just sell access to the highest bidders.
That's
pretty dangerous one to have out there. On a front, I guess I'd say there was a death in my team in Azerbaijan, just 40-year-old woman. She had cancer, and she, after about a 2-year struggle, she died. And she'd been with the embassy about 20 years. She'd been there basically since graduating from college, even before graduating from college. And that impact on our team was so profound because a lot of them had known her since they were basically children. And I really felt like that was one of the biggest challenges for me personally, was sort of shepherding the team and supporting them, and finding resources and ways to honor her and support them. I guess on the sort of other side of the coin, on the rewards, I also found that the people that I connected with were very important to me. One very close friend of mine, he became a very close friend. He was an English teacher and a theater sort of scholar and performer, ended up coming to the United States to study. And when he thought, I can get a full scholarship to go to Finland to study American theater. And I said, why don't you go to New York? Like, come on. And we ended up having this conversations for a year in which I convinced him to do that. And he's still here now and is very happy. The relationship continues, and that is very rewarding in and of itself. But we also were at the beach in Delaware, and 2 or 3 years after I left Belarus, and a girl selling ice cream was like, "Oh, yeah, you came to visit my college. And I'm like, I have barely any memory of that visit because I did so many of them, but it was really touching to me that, I was able to make such an impact on her, and one of a long
Oh
line.
yeah, that must be wonderful to. I mean, because you must be doing all these things where you're not even aware of the impact you're having, but then to get evidence of that later on, that must be a very rewarding part.
Absolutely. It's sort of on the policy side, if you're interested in that as well. I guess I'd say one of the most challenging issues for me to personally deal with, that immediately comes to mind when you ask about challenges is, the policies that I've had to uphold that I didn't agree with at the time. One was renditions policy, if you remember, during the
Oh yeah.
beginning part of the Iraq War, and
Oh.
I was in Luxembourg and I was in charge of human rights, and I was the most junior person in the embassy, and I was in charge of talking to all the European parliamentarians about our policy that they all hated. And I remember thinking, I hate it too. I can't believe I'm supposed to talk to them and tell them something that I don't believe in. And I really ended up spending better part of 2 weeks with the best briefing materials I could find, and studying what our policy was, and scrutinizing it for the most compelling case I could make, and keep my sort of integrity, my internal feeling that I was not selling someone a bill of goods. And I found some great points in John Bellinger's like 500-page brief, and I used those points, and I made relationships with those folks that continue to this day, even though I was essentially arguing a policy they totally disagreed with and argued with me on. But that was difficult for me internally as well, even to figure out how to do that.
I can only imagine that must have been early in your career too. Your very first. Well, I'm glad you stuck with it despite that difficult experience.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you what advice you'll give our students, but before I do that, I have one other question, then we'll open it up. And that is, so you worked on Russia policy in DC, so you'll be posted in Kazakhstan. I'm sure we're very interested to know, many in the audience are interested to know, what are your perspectives on the main U.S. goals currently moving forward? I mean, we maybe don't want to get into the past so much, but in those two, with respect to those two countries, with respect to Russia and also to Kazakhstan, which is of course less in the news, but still very important. What do you see as the main U.S. objectives moving forward, the main strategy and so forth?
Yeah.
Well, in a nutshell.
In a nutshell, I could give you the long version or the short version, but I mean, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think the vast majority of our broad outlines of our policy will actually not change that much for either country or the region. I mean, we are pretty consistent about wanting to support this, sovereignty and security, economic prosperity, and democratic development of all of these countries. But how we do so and to what extent we emphasize each of those factors does change. I do think that on Russia, well, for the whole region, I think we're signaling, that Biden administration is signaling that we want to be more vocal on human rights sort of across the board. Not only just towards China and Iran and Venezuela, as we sort of did for a while, but I think with on the Russia beat, I think there's policy reviews are ongoing for the whole swath of countries, but I think they're going to be looking closely at more targeted sanctions following the Navalny poisoning and the crackdown on the protests. But we're looking at how to support sort of democratic actors and democratic development. I think they're clearly signaling a desire, and I think it's a good decision to restart the work on arms control cooperation with a New Start and beyond, which having lagged, I think it got us into a much more dangerous situation. So trying to balance where does our strategic interest actually move us towards cooperation, and I think to what extent can we parlay that into further broadening cooperation in international organizations on broader issues like climate change that are going to be a priority, as well as Iran issues that are going to be a priority again to try to re-engage. and redevelop a cooperative policy vis-a-vis Iran. But balancing that against the further sort of focus on human rights and democratic actors. In Kazakhstan and in the broader Central Asia region, I think similarly, we've had like similar goals for about the last 10, 15 years. The main difference being that there was that period that I was speaking about earlier where the Afghanistan buildup and the focus on Afghanistan really took away the question of why Central Asia? Why should we pay attention to Central Asia? And DC's attention was pretty well focused on, yes, Central Asia counts, and Afghanistan lens, you can debate whether that in and of itself was enough, but that was part of the reason why Central Asia was, very prominent. And now I think it's just more true that the Central Asia in and of itself has to try a bit harder to compete for that kind of the kind of political attention, the kind of economic attention from the DC policymakers. But
is there a sense that it's kind of, Russia and China have been very involved in the region? They've really ramped up their efforts, China economically, Russia militarily, of course. Is there a sense on the part of U.S. policymakers that really that's kind of Russia-China territory that are, although we should have a presence, of course, it's not really a main focus?
I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, I'd say that maybe the increased focus on the great power competition, and Biden administration is still developing its China policy, but I think is clearly signaled that China focus will continue. I think that almost having China and Russia so close by to the region and so prominent in the region almost strengthens the focus on Central Asia, and yet without Afghanistan it's harder. Turn on a light, it's getting dark in here. It sort of makes it the impetus to work more on electrical and energy connectivity and economic investment and development projects becomes sort of more prominent than necessarily just the security cooperation, though that as well continues to be discussed. I'm well aware of discussions ongoing with Kazakhstan that are promising in that domain, and I think at least Kazakhstan, but perhaps in an increasing manner, Uzbekistan as well historically Kyrgyzstan have really understood that their neighborhood, their dangerous neighborhood, gives them an impetus as well to have other strong partnerships. So that gives us an opening as well.
Oh, that's good. And so I mean, to sum up, then you don't see a major sea change in policy as a result of the change in administration. There might be some movement around the edges, but the nature of the whole foreign policy process is such that there's going to be more continuity than change.
I think you put it very well. Yes.
Oh. Well, I'm just taking my cue from you. Okay, then my last question before we open up, then I know we have in the audience a lot of people who are considering diplomatic careers. What advice would you give to Wisconsin students? I mean, being from Wisconsin yourself, it always seems to me that people who go to school in the East Coast, they're right in the thick of things. They're in DC. It's probably harder for someone from Wisconsin to contemplate what a career is like, how to prepare for it. Do you have any tidbits of wisdom or advice that students in our programs might benefit who are considering a career similar to yours?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think you're interested, if you want to give it a whirl, then go for it. I mean, and by go for it, I mean, invest in the process. And there are materials out there, and they're much more easily available now than 17 years ago, where you can take practice tests. You can talk to people, live humans, about what this diplomacy career is like, and start to have like discussions where you inform yourself, and you can read, of course, but having discussions about what the life and the work is, I think, very helpful to get you more conversant in what really this sort of career involves. I mean, you can continue working on your briefings and your writings, which I can encourage before, but talking to anyone you can, and if you have the chance to intern or work abroad, at an embassy or at the State Department itself in Washington, then do so. I mean, the only impediment is always bureaucratic. You have to start ages in advance in order to get the internships. It's like a year in advance, in part because of the security clearance process, but it's just a protracted process. But I think, if you're trying to decide if this is something you want to do, there's no substitute. I had the advantage, at Georgetown as an undergrad, to talking to a lot of retired foreign service officers and sort of hearing from them about their careers. And that's part of what got me excited about it. I mean, I had no idea. I was from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. I didn't know any diplomats growing up. I just knew I liked international stuff. And I liked people and languages and living abroad. But there are real people who do these jobs, and it can be a very thrilling and very rewarding way to live and work. At least, when I joined, thought, okay, I'll try this for a few years and see how it goes. I haven't felt as though, I've stopped learning or growing in the course of 17 years at it, and part because of the sort of built-in changes in what the actual job responsibilities are.
The rotations through,
yeah. But I still find it
keeps you on your toes, I guess.
Yeah, yes, definitely. But I also still feel a real thrill to being the representative of the United States and helping to both personify and humanize this abstract concept that so many people around the world, I think, still find intimidating or scary or I don't know, not human necessarily. I think that sort of last 3 feet, as we sort of put it in the public diplomacy world, of the human contact is still really a big component of doing the job and doing it well. And I really encourage you to give it a try if you're at all interested.